Okay, let's try again. Welcome everybody this morning to day 2 of our summit, Build a Great Wave of Peace. We've had an amazing time yesterday with very wonderful presentations that were informative, healing, inspiring, and that were grounded in both pragmatic action in the world as well as in expanding our consciousness into our crystalline, true crystalline nature and connecting us into the great sea of spirit and reminding us and helping us remember experientially as well as cognitively that we live in a great soup of unity and diversity. And I want to thank PK, who's with us this morning, who is was one of our presenters yesterday. And PK, do you want to intone about anything about yesterday? Quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Mann. I'm PK Langley, and I created CORE to help people heal. And yesterday was a fabulous day of just outpouring of so many people and so many voices. And I thought that the diversity was beautiful. Really enjoyed the time, Dr. Mann. What I could attend was wonderful.
Great. And PK was amazing. She was the one that just pushed us into unity and oneness in our consciousness by sharing her personal journey of healing from trauma and remembering her true nature and stepping into her authentic passion, purpose, and service to others as the founder and the one who runs the Center of Restorative Energies CORE. So I really encourage you to connect in with her. And you can, yesterday I figured out, PK and everyone, that there is a setting that I can set so you can all now today put in the chat things to everyone. So PK, if you want to put your contact information and your website, you can do that. I think it's going to go out to everyone. You will be the test after I change the setting. I'm Rachel Mann, PhD. I am the founder and co-facilitator of this summit with my wonderful colleague and friend, Mandy Bird. She was with us yesterday and will rejoin us maybe in the course of the day, but will definitely be here at 2:30 when PK, she and I actually co-lead our group brainstorming session. And I hope you will join us for that, bringing any more questions, any heartfelt sharings about what you have gotten out of the summit, as well as being able to put onto the table for the three of us, whatever it is within you that you feel you need support and help with, to heal with, as well as any visions, ideas you have for your catalyzing your passionate service as a sacred activist for peacemaking in the world. So we'll be just there for you to pick our brains and for us to hear your stories and to support you. I am a sacred activist, social scientist, shamanic healer, and spiritual teacher. I've engaged in the work of sacred activism for peacemaking overtly or kind of in the background for really all of my life, but it really took off when I started my career started to become interested in the Soviet Union and Russia at the age of 15. So I'm going to dive into my presentation for today, and share it with you here. And I've got a little bit of a PowerPoint. Those of you who were here yesterday for my presentation, you will probably see that I'm reusing some of the slides and going back over. And hang on, I've got somebody coming on as a participant, which means I need to let them in. So give me a moment here. Okay. Hello, Kathy. All right, I'm going to go to my first slide here and dive into my talk. And what I'm going to do is my computer is very slow today. All right, and that was not supposed to happen. Okay. Yeah, so just as a way, I'm going to do a little synthesis of not only my talk from yesterday, but a little bit of what I learned and what seems applicable to my talk this morning. This, as I was saying in my brief introduction to myself, and if you want to read more about me and my work, you can go to Rachel Mann, PhD.com. And PK, would you mind putting the link, my website in there? That would be great. Maybe you can be the tech facilitator during my talk.
Sure. If you want to make me a co-host, I will help you today.
I will make you a co-host. Hang on a minute. Yes. There you go. You are a co-host, PK. Thank you. All right. So as I shared in the introduction to the summit yesterday with Mandy, the idea for this summit came up because last fall, I had been working with a PR consultant who's in the field of the metaphysical, like many of us here. And she suggested that I do a summit, an online summit. And and you can post your questions and comments in chat, by the way. So, and we will have 10, 15 minutes at the end for me to address your questions. So it didn't really resonate with me where I was last fall. I was really in the process, the beginning processes of realizing that my entire life's work had really been constellated on every level, from my work in academia, in mainstream academia as a professor at the University of Virginia, developing courses on a variety of topics related to violence and peace, and really beginning at the age of 15 when I became interested in Russia and the Soviet Union, when I chose off of a book list for a social studies class, the book by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Solzhenitsyn was living in exile, an exiled writer, very famous writer from Russia, who had been targeted by Stalin. And One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, as well as many of his novels that I read after reading Ivan Denisovich, were about the Stalinist oppression, the oppression of Russians and all the other parts of the Soviet Union by Stalin, who was a brutal authoritarian dictator. And yes, at the age of 15, that was where my head was at. And I read that book and then became very, very fascinated with Russia, and proceeded on to get a BA in Russian studies and an MA in Soviet studies and a PhD in Slavic languages and literatures, but I majored in folklore and minored in anthropology. This is why I call myself a social scientist, because I was doing transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research covering, using many disciplines from history to anthropology to art and literature to culture, folklore, during the course of my studies in higher education. And all of it, I later realized was, my BA thesis, my master's thesis, and my dissertation were all basically constellated around looking at the effects of group traumas, in particular, the effects of authoritarianism on individuals and groups, and then later the effects of emigration due to economic hardship, and the struggle to maintain a sense of authenticity, a sense of to gain healing and wholeness through through art, poetry, and through heroic epic. I did a study of the death epics of heroic epic from Russia, from back in the 13th and 14th centuries, that were still being sung by traveling bards in the rural regions of Russia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, about the defeat of Russia by the Mongols in the 13th century, and then ultimately by immigrants to the southern coalfields of West Virginia from the Carpathian Mountains in what is really now in the territory of eastern Ukraine into southern Ukraine, and down into what is now the Czech Republic and Slovak republics, and how they built their beautiful churches with gold onion domes and tried to maintain their authenticity and identity under the stress of immigration and raising their children in the diaspora. So basically that was my beginning. And then in kind of an interesting way, as the Cold War, when the Cold War came to end in 1991, which was actually the same year that I finished my PhD, my interests had expanded into psychology, psychotherapy, and I was beginning, as a result of meeting my Native American teacher, my first Native American teacher in the early 90s, had become very interested in Native American history and culture and religion and spirituality. And so my interests had diverged. Excuse me. My interests had diverged from focusing solely on Russia. And I was also beginning to look at interdisciplinary perspectives on trauma and violence, trauma, healing, and spirituality. And that interest began to really deepen and escalate when I began my academic career after finishing my PhD. And one of the reasons why I'm so good at technology is because when the Cold War ended, excuse me, some sort of allergy attack. When the Cold War ended, in 91, academic positions in the Russian field in universities and colleges across the United States disappeared. And I retooled, having studied by then 6 languages. And I ended up getting a job at another university in Virginia, overseeing a language laboratory, and then ultimately returned to UVA to be the director of a teaching and technology center, serving the languages and other disciplines in the humanities. And so I was part of the integration of digital technologies into teaching and research at UVA for a decade during the precipitous rise of the World Wide Web. I worked with my faculty colleagues to integrate these technologies into their classrooms. It was a very dynamic and creative time in my life. And I also, as a member of the faculty, was developing courses, as I said, on violence and peace, and teaching them to undergraduates. So peacemaking and what I call educational activism has always been on the front burner for me, as well as one major course I co-taught with a wonderful colleague named John Alexander at UVA. We co-developed and taught it, called Story and Healing. And we dealt with the problem of racism in the US through the lens of story and healing. It was where we integrated spiritual teachings and practices from Buddhism, Native American spirituality, and shamanism. And it was a very, very transformational course. So this has been the trajectory of my work. And then, of course, I left my tenure job in 2007 in order to become a shamanic healer and spiritual teacher. A kind of personal crisis led to that decision. So for the past 15 years, that is what I've been doing, offering spiritual teachings. And the issues of violence and peace, trauma, have always been woven into my teachings, because fundamentally spirituality for me is all about doing the inner work that we need to do to transmute and heal not only our personal wounds, but the wounds of our ancestors, the wounds of the collective. So to fast forward to this year, 2022, as a result of all of that training, all of that education into Russia and authoritarianism, when and Ukrainians are Slavs, they're East Slavs, just like the Russians. There are West Slavs and South Slavs. I won't go into it. But when Putin invaded Ukraine, of course, it just was as if, everything had come full circle for me. And once again, the rise of authoritarianism in Russia, the rise of authoritarian movements around the world. And of course, for me, this really struck deep into the center of my heart, because I have a deep, deep love for Russia, for Russians, a deep love for all Slavs, Ukrainians, you name it. I mean, Bulgarians, all of them. I was, I was part of the beating heart of the Slavic peoples for 15 years of my life. And of course, it was profoundly important for me. It was profoundly hopeful when the Cold War ended, and when Ukraine and other nations that had been under the authoritarian dictatorship of the former Soviet Union began to take back their sovereignty and freedom. This was an extremely positive thing to do, because I realized that in those 15 years, I was holding the light for the end of the Cold War and for the freedom and sovereignty of these peoples and our people and the whole world during that time of the Cold War. So what I want to say, therefore, is the summit came about because of my my desire to really hold this light. And it began to become apparent again under the Trump administration in the US, and then with the 2017 march in Charlottesville, my hometown, of white supremacists, and then the ensuing chaos around the election and the insurrection, the attempted insurrection of our country from the democratic processes, and that is ongoing. I've been more and more galvanized into expanding my message and my mission from shamanism per se. I'm still doing all of that. It's just now packaged. It's all part of what I'm foregrounding, which is my passion and heart for peacemaking as a sacred activist who works at many levels, the multidimensional levels of our being, body, mind, soul, and spirit, the pragmatic to the spiritual, action in the world to the inner work. So I want to review what destiny lines are as I talk about how Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. I know that it is very hard right now, because when we see so much destruction, with the fear that arises with Putin doing this power move that is completely unwarranted, with the way Russia has been has invaded Crimea. Slowly over the past, decade, 2 decades, a slow drip of trying to regain the former territories of the former Soviet Union, with of course the conflict zones in Syria, in Yemen, and around the world, and then the explosion in Ukraine, which really is very close to the hearts of Europeans, Western Europeans, and therefore of the US, who are their allies. It is very, very hard to understand how we are building a great wave of peace with this happening, and with, in fact, the threat of world war. I am not convinced we are going to have a world war. In fact, I see some hope in what is happening in Ukraine. So I'm going to talk briefly about destiny lines. A destiny line is an energetic cord or pathway that is released upon the birth of a new life, a new idea, a new group, a nation, or a world. So this is true of an individual, it's true of a group, it's true of a business, it's true of a nation, it is true of our planet. So what happens is that there is a concept that emerges. Like, I think we think we want to have a baby, or I think I want to have a baby, right? And then that is a concept that then begins to get visualized, that then gets discussed. And so the visualization begins the conversation. And all of this starts as energetic and continues as energetic, because we are energetic beings. We are crystalline beings of light. And as crystalline forms, we have the power to co-create, dream forth what it is that we want and need and long for in the world. And as we emerge out of light into form, through soul, into incarnation, we are really being propelled through a momentum tunnel from conception to visualization. And then that visualization catalyzes the energy of manifestation and is incubated in almost like a womb. So there is an energetic crystalline womb within the higher vibrational dimensions and frequencies with which we coexist, as well as in the mother's physical body, in her womb, as that fetus incubates in her womb. I'm not dealing with the individual today. I am dealing with the collective and with Ukraine specifically. And then what happens is, when everything is right, everything is from conceptualization to visualization, and there is a clarity that manifestation is going to be possible, then life force comes forward to go into manifestation in the outer world, into physical action. And there is a constant interplay between the two. And so it shoots out. We, in essence, shoot out of this energetic matrix. Okay. And so you can think of a destiny line like you think of fireworks. Okay. So a firework is actually a tube, right? At the bottom of which is black powder. And then there's smaller containers within it that are packed with crystals and stones that have that when ignited with heat will explode, right? And so all of this is packed in. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, into this cone. And then the fire is lit, and boom, we have what you see here, fireworks. Now, of course, there are probably a number of different firework cones, right, that are connected to each of these lines that you see here, right, that are coming out. But this is what a destiny line looks like as it comes out of that cone of manifestation, out of that manifestation tunnel. And so these pathways of light come shooting out. And then they manifest, and they then are what creates the manifestation of the world. Okay. What this really means is, and as you can see in the picture of the fireworks, is that because we are energetic first, we have the free will and power to catalyze certain destiny lines over others. So as human beings, individually, as a group, as soul families, and all of the human beings on Mother Earth are a soul family, and then within them are groupings of other, smaller clusters of soul families, but we are all one and interrelated. We all chose to dream forth this planet, from all of our ancestors thousands of years back to all of us here into the future. So we are all co-creating this planet. And that means that anything that happens, any choice that we make individually, as a group, collectively, as the human family, it's all part of a destiny line. All right. So right now, Ukraine is central to the ongoing movement towards peace. And I'm going to really insist upon this truth today, because Mandy talked yesterday about, how the grief that we have, the grief and the losses that we carry in our personal lives, and of course the grief, the fear, the anger, the despair that all of us are feeling in these times where so much is happening that is perilous, where we are seeing very clearly the shadow of mind of domination, mind of oppression, mind of separation, and its manifestation in violence from subtle to overt. In other words, right now, our collective eyes are really, we are being challenged to turn our collective eyes onto this deep and profound shadow that has been part of humanity's destiny line in this space-time continuum, in this physical space-time continuum. And it is really in all of our faces. And that also means that all those who are, and PK said something very powerful yesterday, that all those who are suffering. So I'm a person of privilege. I mean, I'm not in Ukraine. I am a white woman of European ancestry. I live in a rural, bucolic place in Central Virginia, in one of the richest nation in the world. I am not being directly affected by war, though I had my own traumas and suffering in the past. But the fact of the matter is that, I'm not there. But the truth is that all of those people, humanity, all of those people across the world who are suffering as a result of this mind of domination and mind of oppression, the victims and the perpetrators are on a soul level doing really a powerful service right now, because they are part of making sure that we see and we understand and we know that this is not just, this is not right. And Ukrainians are holding a very powerful position right now in the world. So there has been the creep of the Russian invasion of former territories of the Soviet Union. There has been the rising authoritarian movements in Hungary, in the US, across even the UK, the authoritarianism, obviously, of China, and the authoritarian religious movements in the Middle East and so on. Ukrainians are holding holding a very special place in this critical time. And so I really, as you listen to this, I want to actually help lift you up, even as you honor your grief and your fear and your rage, your self-righteous anger at the injustice, at the harm being done, at the terrorism, at the genocide. I want you to find a place within yourself today where you can find a glimmer of hope. Okay, I want to talk about our global destiny line to a future of unity and diversity, of peace and compassion. All right, because unity and diversity, peace and compassion is natural. That is the human way. The human way is not this violence that we see. Yes, there is natural aggression related to meeting survival needs. We see this in nature, in predator and prey. That is natural aggression. That is not violence. So yes, of course, there is this capacity for aggression within us. But what we have seen historically through time is a kind of distortion, amplification of that natural aggression into something that is not natural, that is not the human way. So we can argue about this. There are people who argue about this ad nauseum, but I know this to be true. From the many visionary experiences that I have had entering into the cosmic matrix, the cosmic collective memory of humanity, and experiencing violence of many kinds, where I was both a perpetrator, a victim, a passive bystander. I know this from decades of the academic interdisciplinary study of violence, war, genocide, and all forms of abuse. This is the conviction that I've come to after decades. It is, in fact, I believe, a soul conviction that came with me when I was incarnated into this time. So I'm going to talk about why the war in Ukraine is part of catalyzing this destiny line. And I'm going to look, and we could go further back, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to talk about the 20th century into the 21st century. So something happened in the early 20th century that was very, very radical compared to what had been happening up until the first two world wars. It is not that human beings going back in history, fighting all kinds of wars around the planet. It is not that there were not individuals, groups, leaders of nations, leaders of insurrections and so on, who did not understand that war is terrible. We know that many great Native American leaders came forward in the 19th century out of the horror of war and Holocaust. Like Chief Seattle said, "I will fight war no more," right? Because what war taught them was how horrible it is, and that there is nothing to be gained from this violence. However, having said that, like Ukrainians, Native Americans had to defend themselves with violence. And so I'm going to meet violence with violence, and I'm going to get into that when we get to the war in Ukraine and what that has to do with peacemaking. So what happened in World War I was that there began to be a growing awareness that men would come back from the front with what they called shell shock. And of course, later, as psychological understandings of what is now called PTSD emerged, they realized, of course, that shell shock was basically just PTSD, right? So there began to be, because of Freud and the awakening in the West to psychology, to the reawakening of the West to the inner psyche, to psychology in the late 19th centuries and into the early 20th century, that there was a psychological impact from war, and it began to be talked about, right, by scholars, academicians, and so on. Then World War II came, the same horror. And then, of course, the Nazi death camps were found and opened and revealed to the world in video, in pictures. So one of the big things that happened in World War I and World War II was images. And then as the Jews, the homosexuals, the Roman Catholics, as well as dissenters that the Nazis had not only gassed to death, but rounded up and put into these camps, the world became aware of the horror and wrong of genocide. The horror and wrong of genocide of a group of people. And many, many Jews who survived the death camps came forward with their stories, who had lost, family members in the gas chambers. And there were many, many writers who became very, very well known. And so what happened in the early 20th century is human consciousness was being awakened. And then on top of this, then you had, I'm going to slam through this. On top of this, you had Martin Luther King. You had Gandhi. And what Gandhi did and proposed to first in Pakistan, first in South Africa, and then in India, not Pakistan, which was nonviolence, the principles of nonviolence, and bringing a spiritual practice into a way of facing domination, oppression, and violence, calling in a spiritual force that exists within all of us. Peace is the human way. And so in the work that he did, first in South Africa and then in India, it was a radical notion. So you have these two events, the Holocaust and Gandhi, the nonviolent movement in India. The horror, the wrong, the injustice of war and genocide, and another way to confront and face this shadow in the human, this soul sickness in the human psyche, and in individuals and groups who are manifesting it in their actions, in their thoughts, in their ideas. And he emphasized inner work. Inner work was part of nonviolence. Then Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movements in the United States. Martin Luther King basically drew upon Gandhi and took these principles and began to speak truth to authority, truth to injustice. So these two men were profoundly impactful. And as we know, that nonviolent movements against injustice, then unfolded in South Africa, Nelson Mandela being a leader of that movement, and so on. And then we see the end of the Cold War in 1991. Now, even though we can now argue that the Cold War was really still simmering underneath, what I would say is the wound to Russia that was at the end of the Cold War was still unhealed, untransmuted, unaddressed. And we see how Putin is manifesting that woundedness and also his personal woundedness from the siege of Leningrad during World War II, where he lost a sister and where the siege went on with starvation and famine and death and killing for 4 years. He and his family lived through it. And so we see how this unhealed wound from war from the loss of face of the end of the Cold War, of the fall of the Soviet Union, was simmering underneath. All right. Now, this is now in the 21st century. So now we come to then the emerging, increasing peaceful protests, Arab Spring, Black Lives Matter. In China, we saw, finally, I think in the late 20th, I've lost track of time, the late 20th century, we saw protesters in China, of all places, standing up and facing down tanks. So this understanding that the widening consciousness of humanity, we can see expanding and expanding, and this is the great wave of peace. And then we have the war in Ukraine. Ukrainians have shown nobleness of heart, as my colleague Chris Saadi, who spoke yesterday, would call it. Zelensky is a beacon of the nobleness of heart. And absolutely, it has been necessary for them to take up arms to defend themselves. Peacemaking, the destiny lines of peacemaking does not, so you can see how that even events as we are seeing today serve to wake us up individually and collectively. Every individual. So Donald Trump, the president of Hungary, right? Every individual who engages actively in acts of oppression, suppression, violence, genocide, on a soul level, they are being given a powerful opportunity to awaken their consciousness to the injustice, to the wrong of this pathway, of this destiny line. Though they may not awaken in this particular incarnation, they will awaken, I guarantee you, as their soul continues the journey, incarnation through incarnation. And in fact, since time is holographic, not linear, past, present, and future, it is happening within a constellation of experiences, of lives. And so each and every one is impacting the other. So the work that I've been doing in this life as a peacemaker is in fact transmuting those lifetimes when I was a perpetrator. The same is true for us collectively, humanity. So all of us are being given an opportunity to learn and understand a new way. And in the meantime, we have been the recipients of those who have been sacred activists, whether consciously or unconsciously, as peacemakers. And we are building together, therefore, this destiny line that is expanding. So I love this picture because this is what this destiny line, this great wave of peace looks like. It is coming from the future and it is coming from the past. And Ukrainians with their noble hearts, their authenticity, with their suffering, are in fact continuing the energetic transformation, transmutation of human consciousness, so that we will then continue to build this future that is going to emerge, that has been predicted by many powerful Native American leaders. It is in the prophecies of Native Americans going back many, 100 or more years, that this is coming, though we are having to endure in the process the darkening, what seems to be the darkening of the skies. And so I'm going to end here and open up to questions and just say that Mandy and I are going to be offering, we are offering a course on August 20th to go deeper into these topics and these practices for navigating global darkness with tools from sacred activism for peacemaking. And so if you want to really deepen the energetic vibration within you and within all of us, I hope you'll join us. So I'm now going to open up the floor to questions, and I'm going to look at the chat. I see that everybody's been very busy in the chat. And I don't know, PK, if you want to summarize stuff in chat for me.
We don't currently have any questions yet, Rachel. We do have some marvelous additions while you were sharing from Mark, but not any
great.
questions.
Mark. Great. Okay. Okay, anybody have questions? Mark, you were in Russia. You studied Russian. Oh my God, I remember that. We talked about that. Yeah. Okay. I'm here. I'm available. We have 10 minutes.
I have a quick question while everybody is percolating. Other countries are beginning to experience economic hardships, and things are going on in multiple nations.
Yeah.
Do you see Ukraine as a pinwheel, or do you see this as an event that's happening everywhere?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, you know, in a way, I think it goes back to what I'm saying about Ukraine being central in a sense, right? Because Russia and Ukraine are the breadbasket of the world, you know, along with some other nations, but, you know, they definitely are big. And we are seeing how the Ukrainian war is causing tremendous economic hardship, particularly in nations that are already have been struggling with food shortages and you know, other problems. So yeah, so I mean, it's a powerful ripple effect, right? A powerful ripple effect, because it is a reminder. I think that it's easy, it has been all too easy for nations, for people in nations, for leaders of nations to think of ourselves, of themselves as you know, in these little silos, right? And I mean, in fact, you know, World War I and World War II began to break down that concept that we live in a silo, right? And the idea of NATO, the idea of the United Nations also, which is something I could put on this map of the destiny line, you know, have been powerful forces, you know, recognizing our dynamic interdependence. So I would say that what is happening in Ukraine is simply expanding our awareness of this by the profound ripple effect that this war is having on the world in terms of economic, you know, survival needs, right?
Thank you.
Anyone else? Comments? Yeah, and I'll say, Mark, in response to you saying people to people, yeah, I mean, you know, I had friends in Russia. I also, you know, I was a translator interpreter one summer for the Soviet American Youth Orchestra, which was an initiative of USIA, of the American government, and the Russian government, USIA, which was the United States Information Agency. And they facilitated a lot of cultural exchanges between Russians and Americans during the Cold War. And, you know, all of this diplomacy, negotiation, exchanges, cultural exchanges, scientific exchanges, all of these things are part of building that great wave of peace. And I believe that they contributed to the end. But yes, when people are in relationship with one another, it becomes harder for them to turn each other into the enemy. And yes, erosion of environmental laws, voting rights. Yeah. I would say that this is a reflection of a kind of, you know, in family systems therapy models, I'm sure Chris could say more about this because she is a psychotherapist. In family systems therapy models, I think maybe each of us has had an experience of where we decided to break out of the entrenched family dynamic or family system, right? Okay. That could be through PK's story of, you know, leaving the nest of Christianity, right? And what happens when we started to do that breaking out, to actually discovering our true natural individual authenticity and following that soul's deep longing, that personal heart's longing to be truly authentic to ourselves, right? And that meant breaking the rules, right? Or violating the norms within the family, and also dismantling the conditioning, which then of course is in everybody's face in the family system, because you're challenging them, right? And then what happens is that all of a sudden everybody's creating crises, having crises. They're trying to pull you back into that system, right? That's what happens. That's how it works. All right. And some of those family members, maybe they have an aha moment. Ta-da! Oh, right. And so you are the catalyst to wake up some individuals in your family. And yet some of them just dig in like a dog digging in their rear end and their back paws, and they are like not going to budge. Okay. But it's fine. They may not budge in the moment, but they're eventually going to have to budge, whether they do it in this life or another. And remember, we're talking about a destiny line that is rippling forward through many generations. Native Americans bring this perspective about Native Americans, about how everything, the seeds that we are planting, will then come forth 7 generations. They will flower fully 7 generations in the future. The Dalai Lama, I always say, may never be able to return to Tibet, his home country. He may never see the freeing of Tibet from China. The Dalai Lama, with his spiritual beliefs in reincarnation and his understanding of the fact that our time in history is like a tiny little spark in eternity. The Dalai Lama understands that everything that he has done and is doing in his life is going, all the seeds that are being planted, the spreading of Tibetan culture, Buddhism outside of Tibet, is planting the seeds for this new future of compassion and kindness, not just for Tibetans and for Buddhism, but for everybody. Okay, so we have to look at it with this broader viewpoint and see that this rising authoritarianism in the world, the pushback that is happening is kind of like, we're becoming the enlightened, awakened family members, and everybody who's stuck in the old conditioning is fighting back tooth and nail. So in a way, you can see this as good news, because it means something good is happening. Because even if that family member never changes, so when my mother died, she was very sick, very mentally ill, very abusive. But death is really an illusion. And after she died, all the work that I had done to awaken her, to try to help her heal, began to flower on a soul level. And she did come to me and ask for forgiveness. In fact, she called me in a dream not long after she died. And I picked up the phone and she said to me, "You were right." So when we look at this from the greater dimension of the soul and spirit, that's the position we have to take. And ultimately, though we feel our grief and anger and our fear, we have to understand that everything is interconnected. The violence that is happening is interconnected with the peacemaking, right? And they are like, it's like the baking of bread, right? The peacemaking is the yeast. It is, you know, the kneading of the bread, right? And then we're putting it in the oven to cook. And guess what? It's delicious in the end. All right. I thank all of you. And if you have any more questions for me about this, I invite you to put them in the chat. If you're watching this, in recording later on, please feel free to email me. And I thank you. And as I say at the end of any talk or teaching or ceremony or meditation that I do, I pray that all the goodness of the words that we have spoken, the words that I have spoken, be for the benefit of all beings, that all beings will live in joy and happiness, peace, unity, and harmony, that all beings will be fed, that our Mother Earth will be nurtured and supported, that all flowering grow into a future of compassion. May it be so. Aho, wado. And I send that energetically out with the breath of love, the breath of light. All right, I'm going to end the recording from my presentation.